In July 1518, a woman named Frau Troffea stepped out of her half-timbered house in Strasbourg and began to dance. 6 days later, she was still dancing. Within a month, 400 people had joined her, and the city's desperate solution to stop them would only make things worse. Picture medieval Strasbourg, a prosperous trading hub on the Rhine River, part of the Holy Roman Empire. By 1518, this wasn't some backwater village. This was a sophisticated city with universities, medical schools, and a thriving merchant class. These weren't superstitious peasants. They were educated burghers, skilled craftsmen, respected physicians, which makes what happened next even more disturbing. Because when rational, educated people start dancing themselves to death in the streets, when doctors prescribe more dancing as the cure, when an entire city watches its citizens collapse from exhaustion and keeps playing music for them, you have to ask, what could possibly drive hundreds of people to lose control of their own bodies? The date, July 14th, 1518. The location, a narrow cobblestone street near Strasbourg's timber market. The temperature, sweltering, in the midst of one of the hottest summers on record. Frau Troffea, a housewife whose husband sold goods in the market square, suddenly lurched into the street and began a solitary dance. No music played. No festival was underway. The feast of St. Vitus, the patron saint of dancers, was still weeks away. Witnesses would later describe her movements as violent, almost aggressive. Arms flailing, feet stomping, her body twisting in movements that looked more like combat than celebration. This wasn't a joyful dance, this was something else entirely. To understand why 400 people would eventually join Frau Troffea in her deadly dance, you need to understand what Strasbourg was like in the summer of 1518. The previous winter had been brutal. Crops had frozen in the fields. By spring, grain prices had tripled. The city's orphanages were overflowing, not with orphans, but with children whose parents could no longer feed them. The poor were mixing sawdust into their bread just to have something that felt like food in their stomachs. One chronicler described 1517 with just 2 words: bad year. But starvation was just the beginning. A new disease had recently appeared in Europe, syphilis, which they called the French disease. Unlike plague, which killed you quickly, syphilis rotted you slowly from the inside out. Noses collapsed, bones dissolved, bodies became covered in weeping sores. The clergy declared it God's punishment for sin, and there was no cure. Meanwhile, strange weather patterns had people talking about the end times. Unusually harsh winters followed by scorching summers. Hailstorms in August that destroyed what little crops remained. Blood-red sunsets that lingered for hours, probably from volcanic ash in the atmosphere, though they didn't know that then. And then there was the political situation. The Holy Roman Empire was fracturing. Just 1 year earlier, Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to a church door, sparking the Protestant Reformation. In the countryside around Strasbourg, peasant uprisings had been brutally crushed. Bodies still hung from trees along the main roads as warnings. The social contract between nobles and commoners, already strained, was breaking apart. But here's what made Strasbourg particularly vulnerable to what was about to happen. The city sat at the centre of what medieval people called the St. Vitus Corridor, a stretch along the Rhine and Moselle rivers where, for centuries, outbreaks of dancing mania had periodically occurred. The last major one had been in 1374, when thousands of people across the region had danced uncontrollably for weeks. The people of Strasbourg knew these stories. They'd grown up with them. Every child knew that St. Vitus, if angered, could curse you to dance until you died. There were paintings in the local churches showing sinners dancing in hellish processions. There was even a shrine to St. Vitus just 30 miles away in Saverne, where victims of the dancing curse supposedly went to be cured. So when Frau Troffea began her dance on that July morning, the people watching didn't think she was having a seizure or suffering from heat stroke. They knew exactly what they were seeing. St. Vitus had come to Strasbourg. But here's what the history books rarely mention. 3 days before Frau Troffea began dancing, something else happened in Strasbourg that no one connected to the plague until centuries later. The city council had just passed a new ordinance banning begging in the streets. Anyone caught asking for alms would be branded and expelled from the city. For the growing population of desperate, starving citizens, this was a death sentence. Contemporary records show that on July 11th, 3 days before the dancing began, a crowd of beggars had gathered at the cathedral to protest. They were dispersed by force. Among that crowd, according to a document discovered in the Vatican archives in 1967, was a woman matching Frau Troffea's description. Think about that for a moment. A desperate woman, possibly starving, certainly traumatized, watches as her last hope for survival is violently crushed. 3 days later, she begins a dance that will consume the city. Was this really a supernatural curse? Or was Frau Troffea's body expressing something her voice couldn't? A protest so profound that it transcended conscious control. Within 24 hours of Frau Troffea's first steps, she'd been joined by 3 others. By the end of the first week, 34. The dancers moved with the same violent, jerky motions. Their faces remained blank, eyes unfocused. They didn't speak, didn't respond to their names. When family members tried to restrain them, they fought with superhuman strength to keep dancing. The city's physicians were called in. These weren't village healers or folk doctors. Strasbourg had a medical college, one of the most respected in the empire. The physicians examined the dancers and came to a conclusion based on the best medical knowledge of their time. The victims were suffering from overheated blood. Their humours were imbalanced. The heat had risen to their brains, causing a kind of fever that manifested as dance. The treatment they prescribed would seem like madness to us, but followed a certain logic. If the dancing was caused by excess heat and energy, then the cure was to let that energy burn itself out. The dancers needed to dance more, not less, but they needed to do it properly with music and rhythm to help regulate their movements and eventually exhaust the fever. On August 3rd, the city council put this plan into action. They cleared out 2 guild halls and the grain market. They built a stage in the horse market. They hired the best musicians in the city: drums, pipes, fiddles. They even hired strong men to partner with the dancers, to hold them upright when they began to collapse, to keep them moving. The physician's notes from August 5th record something chilling. The dancers show no signs of tiring, though many have not eaten in days. Their feet are bloody, leaving red prints upon the platforms, yet they continue as if feeling no pain. By the second week of August, something had gone catastrophically wrong. Instead of burning out, the dancing plague was spreading faster than ever. The stages set up by the city council had become magnets for new victims. People would come to watch and find themselves suddenly compelled to join in. A contemporary chronicle describes the scene. The dancers' feet were bruised and bloody, their faces gaunt and vacant-eyed, their bodies convulsing in spasmodic agony. Many could not eat or sleep. They danced through the day and into the night, and when they collapsed, they were carried to the side where they lay twitching, their legs still moving as if dancing while unconscious. Here's a detail that often gets overlooked. Not everyone who joined the dancing did so unwillingly. Some people, driven to desperation by hunger and hopelessness, threw themselves into the dance deliberately, seeing it as a form of religious ecstasy or penance. If St. Vitus was punishing the city, they reasoned, then perhaps by joining the dance voluntarily, they could appease him. But voluntary or not, once you started dancing, you couldn't stop. The death toll began to mount. The exact number is disputed. Some chronicles claim 15 people died per day at the peak. Others suggest the total deaths were in the dozens rather than hundreds. But what's undeniable is that people were dying. Strokes, heart attacks, exhaustion. Bodies pushed beyond their limits simply gave out. On August 7th, a wealthy merchant named Hans Trummer watched his teenage daughter join the dancers. His account, preserved in the city archives, provides one of the most detailed descriptions we have. She had come to bring water to the afflicted, as was her Christian duty, but as she approached the platform, her body began to shake. She dropped the water jug, which shattered on the stones. Her arms flew up as if pulled by invisible strings. Within moments, she was dancing as frantically as the rest. I called her name, grabbed her arms, but she looked through me as if I wasn't there. My daughter was gone, and in her place was this creature that danced. By August 10th, with possibly 400 people now caught in the dance, the city council made a dramatic reversal. The dancing stages were torn down, the musicians were sent home, a total ban on all public music and dancing was declared. Even wedding celebrations were forbidden from having any music louder than a single lute. But more importantly, the council had changed their diagnosis. This was no natural disease. This was divine punishment. The question was, punishment for what? The clergy had their theories. Some blamed the city's tolerance of gambling and prostitution. Others pointed to the recent ordinance against beggars. Hadn't Christ commanded charity to the poor? Still others saw it as a warning about the religious upheavals of the Reformation. Whatever the cause, the solution was clear. The dancers needed to be taken to the shrine of St. Vitus in Severn. The logistics of this was staggering. How do you transport 400 people who can't stop dancing 30 miles over rural roads? The answer: with great difficulty. The dancers were loaded into wagons, their arms and legs bound to stop them from injuring themselves or others. The journey took 3 days, with the procession stopping frequently to rest the horses and tend to dancers who had collapsed. The ritual at Severn was unlike anything in standard Catholic practice. This was folk religion, ancient and strange, tolerated by the church but never fully embraced. The dancers were led into a small grotto chapel, where a wooden statue of St. Vitus stood. Each dancer was given a small cross to hold, and had tiny red shoes placed on their feet. Not real shoes, but symbolic ones, no bigger than a child's finger. These shoes were blessed with holy water and marked with crosses in holy oil. Then came the crucial part. The dancers were led in a choreographed procession around the statue. This was still dancing, but controlled, ritualized dancing. They moved in a circle, priests chanting in Latin, incense thick in the air. The idea was to transform their chaotic, cursed dance into a holy dance, to redirect the energy from demonic to divine. According to witnesses, it worked. One by one, the dancers began to slow. Their movements became less frantic. Some collapsed, not from exhaustion this time, but from release. They wept, they prayed, they slept. When they woke, the compulsion to dance was gone. Word was sent back to Strasbourg. St. Vitus had forgiven them. By September, the dancing plague was over. The last dancers had been cured at the shrine. No new cases had emerged, and the city began to return to normal. Music was allowed again. Markets reopened, but the trauma lingered. Frau Troffea, the woman who started it all, disappeared from the historical record after being taken to Severn in late July. We don't know if she recovered, if she died, or if she simply left Strasbourg and never returned. Her husband appears in merchant records the following year, but alone. The city council commissioned a full report on the incident, portions of which survive. They concluded that the plague had been caused by sin, though they remained diplomatically vague about which specific sins. New ordinances were passed regulating public dancing, limiting it to certain holy days and requiring official permission for any gathering with music. The medical faculty at the university published their own analysis, still maintaining that hot blood had been the primary cause, but acknowledging that divine intervention had provided the cure. It was a careful balancing act between emerging scientific thinking and established religious authority. Here's what makes the Strasbourg dancing plague particularly fascinating. It wasn't unique. Between the 14th and 17th centuries, at least 10 major outbreaks of dancing mania were recorded in the Rhine and Moselle valleys, always in the same region, always during periods of extreme social stress, always ending when the dancers were taken to a religious shrine. In 1374, thousands of people across the region danced for weeks. In 1428, a monk in Schaffhausen danced himself to death. In 1536, children in Basel began dancing uncontrollably and had to be taken to a chapel for healing. But after the 17th century, the dancing plagues stopped. They simply ceased to occur. What changed? In the 1970s, historian H.C. Eric Middelfer proposed that the dancers had been poisoned by ergot, a fungus that grows on damp rye and contains compounds similar to LSD. It was an attractive theory, a scientific explanation for seemingly inexplicable behaviour. But ergot poisoning doesn't actually match the symptoms. Ergotism causes severe muscle cramps, hallucinations, and gangrene, not sustained dancing. People poisoned by ergot can barely walk, let alone dance for days. In 2008, historian John Waller published the most comprehensive study of the dancing plague to date. His conclusion: mass psychogenic illness, what we used to call mass hysteria. The dancers weren't poisoned or possessed. They were experiencing a culturally specific form of psychological distress that manifested as involuntary movement. Think about it. The people of Strasbourg believed absolutely in the power of St. Vitus to curse them with dancing. They'd grown up hearing stories of previous dancing plagues. They were under extreme psychological stress from famine, disease, and social upheaval. When Frau Troffea began dancing and couldn't stop, observers immediately interpreted it through the lens of their beliefs. This was St. Vitus's curse. That belief, that expectation was contagious. Others who were equally stressed, equally desperate, equally guilt-ridden about their sins became susceptible. The mind, believing it should dance, made the body dance. It's similar to how people in certain cultures experience spirit possession or speaking in tongues. The behaviour is real, the loss of voluntary control is genuine, but the cause is psychological, not supernatural. Remember how the city council initially treated the dancing plague by encouraging more dancing? By building stages in the most public parts of the city. This might have been the worst possible response. John Waller describes it. Few acts could have been more conducive to triggering an all-out psychic epidemic than the councillors' decision to corral the dancers into the most public parts of the city. Their visibility ensured that other city folk dwelt on their own sins and the possibility that they might be next. Every citizen walking through the market would see the dancers, bloody feet, vacant eyes, bodies moving beyond exhaustion. The fear of joining them became so intense that it created the very thing it feared. It's like telling someone not to think of a pink elephant, the mind rebels, and suddenly pink elephants are all you can think about. The stages meant to contain the plague became its greatest amplifiers. What finally ended the plague wasn't medicine or rest, it was ritual. The procession around St. Vitus's statue, the red shoes, the holy water, these symbols had power because people believed they had power. The same psychological mechanism that started the plague also ended it. This isn't to diminish what the dancers experienced. Their suffering was real. The loss of control was genuine. Several people did die, but the cause and the cure both lay in the remarkable power of the human mind to create its own reality. Modern cases of mass psychogenic illness follow similar patterns. In 1962, workers in an American textile factory became convinced they were being bitten by a mysterious bug. Dozens developed real welts and rashes. No bug was ever found. In 2011, teenagers in Leroy, New York developed Tourette's-like symptoms that spread through social groups. The symptoms were real, but no physical cause was identified. What these cases share with Strasbourg 15/18 is the combination of existing stress, a culturally available explanation for symptoms, and social transmission of behaviour. The mind, under enough pressure, can make the body do extraordinary things. 8 years after the dancing plague, the legendary physician Paracelsus visited Strasbourg to investigate what had happened. His conclusions were remarkably ahead of their time and remarkably misogynistic. Paracelsus divided the dancing mania into 3 categories: chorea imaginativa, caused by imagination, chorea lasciva, caused by sexual desire, and chorea naturalis, caused by physical illness. He believed Frau Troffea suffered from the second type, that she had started dancing to embarrass or manipulate her husband, and then lost control of her own performance. While his specific diagnosis was wrong and sexist, Paracelsus was one of the first to suggest that the dancing plague originated in the mind rather than from supernatural causes or poisons. He wrote, "The disease comes from mere opinion and idea, assumed by imagination, affecting those who believe in such a thing." The dancing plague of 1518 remains one of history's most disturbing and fascinating medical mysteries. Not because we don't know what caused it, we have a pretty good idea, but because of what it reveals about the human condition. 400 people in a sophisticated medieval city dance themselves to exhaustion, and sometimes death, because their minds, shaped by culture and broken by stress, told their bodies to move and wouldn't let them stop. The authorities, despite their best intentions, made it worse by trying to help. The only cure came from addressing the psychological cause with an equally psychological solution. The dancing stopped in September 1518, but the questions it raised haven't. In our own time of social media contagions, viral behaviours and mass anxiety, the dancing plague of Strasbourg feels less like ancient history and more like a warning. Those dancers in the summer of 1518 weren't primitive or ignorant. They were people like us, caught in circumstances that pushed them past a breaking point we don't fully understand. They remind us that human behaviour, individual and collective, remains capable of surprises that no amount of modern sophistication can fully explain or prevent. The stages have been torn down, the music has stopped, but somewhere in the space between mind and body, between belief and behaviour, the dance continues,